Start here. Okay. Hello to everyone. I hope can you guys hear us?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Alex François, and I belong to Lattice, the Lattice lab department in Paris of CNRS and École Normale Supérieure. And I also belong to Labex EFL, le Laboratoire d'Excellence, Empirical Foundations of Linguistics. And this year, the Labex EFL has decided to invite our international guest as international chair, who is Athanasios Georgakopoulos, who is with us today and who will be here for 4 weeks. And so I'll take us a minute to introduce Dr. Georgakopoulos, who is currently assistant professor in historical linguistics at the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics in the School of English in Thessaloniki, in Greece, in the Université Aristote. And his first work was in Greek philology, and especially looking at ancient Greek on various aspects of semantics, including spatial semantics and motion, the linguistic construal of motion. And this was his thesis and also his first years of work. And since then, Athanasios has been involved in various aspects of studying semantics and comparing semantics across languages on the one hand, so doing linguistic typology or semantic typology, which is of course an interest that I share and that many people here share, semantic typology, and also probably because he was looking at ancient Greek, which has such a long history of documentation and philology, that was also an occasion for him to look into historical linguistics. So Athanasios has been working a lot on historical linguistics, historical semantics, including with so he's had several projects and he's worked in several universities of Europe, in Münster, Berlin, Kassel in Germany, Liège in Belgium, Moscow in Russia, and now in Greece, in Thessaloniki, always on different aspects of semantic typology or semantic history or pragmatics and or other similar domains, related also to cognitive linguistics. And semantic maps has been one of his main points of interest in the late few years, particularly through a project called LeDiaSema, Lexical Diachronic Semantic Maps. And that was the occasion for me actually to have the pleasure to meet Athanasios a few years ago. And so now I'm happy to introduce him. And can you share your slides?
I can't, my camera does not work for some reason.
The camera doesn't work. Can you try the slide sharing in case at least these work? At least, yes, your slides are visible. That's nice. Okay. And
you can't see, right?
We can now.
So,
yes. And so, without further ado, I'm happy to give the floor to Athanasios Georgakopoulos for his first lecture among 4. So as you understood from maybe the messages, it's going to be 4 sessions on Thursdays, 4 p.m., for which you can come to Paris, in a nice sunny Paris at the moment, and near Panthéon, or you're welcome to come online. So today, the first, this will be the first session of a cycle of 4 about representing lexical polysemy from semantic maps to language-specific networks. The floor is yours.
All right, I think you can hear me. I think you can mute yourself.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
But now you have your mic. Okay.
You can hear me, I trust. So thank you very much, Alex, for the kind introduction, for the kind words, as always. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here for the whole month, holding the International Chair of Labex. As Alex mentioned, this will be my first talk in a series of 4 seminars with the title Representing Lexical Polysemy from Semantic Maps to Language-Specific Networks. So that's the title for the whole series. And for starters, I have brought an outline. I will give you an outline of the 4 talks. Today, I will be talking about semantic maps specifically, and I will give an overview of the method. And then the second seminar will be more on the practical side, so we will move from theory to practice. It won't be a hands-on session, but I hope that after this seminar, all of you will be able to construct your semantic maps either manually or automatically. And the third seminar will be devoted to the quantitative approaches to semantic change and to area linguistic typology. So, yeah, in a way, I will present 2 case studies, 2 studies that I have conducted with the colleagues on the diachrony, on how one can add the dimension of diachrony into semantic maps. And again, the question on how different methods, different tools, different representational tools like semantic maps, collexification networks, and so on, can be used to detect patterns in areal typology and universal patterns in general. And finally, I will move from the linguistic typology part to the more language-specific part, where I will discuss the so-called behavioral profile approach to polysemy, in which meanings I will try to argue for an approach to polysemy in which meanings are represented as enriched lexical constructions. So that's the overview. So today I will be talking about semantic maps. Now I will not take for granted anything, so we'll start from scratch, from the very beginning. And I think that it's better if you interrupt me at any point. So rather than having the whole lecture at once, so it's better that we have this dialogue during the presentation. Of course, after the presentation, there will be a Q&A section. This is the outline of today's seminar. First, I will talk about networks in linguistics. So this will be my introductory remarks, and I will compare language-specific networks, that is polysemy networks, and semantic maps / collexification networks. I'm not doing a distinction right now, but you'll see that I make a distinction in general. And then the main topic, which is to introduce semantic maps, will consist of many subparts. First of all, I will talk about this distinction between collexification networks and semantic maps. Then I will present the different types of semantic maps, that is connectivity maps and proximity maps. Then I will discuss some issues with both approaches, both the connectivity map approach and the proximity map approach. After that, I will be discussing the different types of meanings that can be placed on the map, that is grammatical, lexical, constructional. And I will then show you some other representational modes other than the ones that I will have shown later. And finally, I will conclude with the overall scope of the method. And so this will be my last section. So some introductory remarks. I will be starting with some key terms. First of all, since we're talking about networks, we're talking about graphs, and we take notations, labels, and keys from this field. So in graph theory, a graph consists of a set V of vertices, also called nodes, and a set E of edges. And the edge joins two nodes, two vertices, A and B. And this edge is represented by a set of vertices it connects. So you can see here in this figure, we have the nodes, and the node A and the node B, and these two nodes are connected via a connecting line, and the technical term for this connecting line is edge. And generally speaking, we assume that there is some sort of a relation between the two nodes. And here you can see a first example of a graph, and this is a network of the main characters of Frozen. You see here Christoph, Elsa, Anna, and Olaf. These are the nodes, and there are edges connecting these nodes, and these edges have a specific meaning. That is, this represents how many times Elsa, for example, talked to Anna. And from this figure, we can infer that Anna and Christoph were involved in more conversations than, for example, Anna and Olaf. So the edge here, the thickness of the edge, is proportional to the frequency of the dialogues we see in this movie. All right, as for linguistics, there are, and specifically in semantics, because I'm talking about networks in semantics, there are at least three types of networks. First of all, check figure 2. One can see the polysemic radial network for the preposition over, where we have nodes, again, see several nodes and edges, but again, this is language-specific network, right? So it does not have any cross-linguistic validity, which is the case with the two following figures, figure 3 and figure 4, where we see a semantic map of typical dative functions in figure 3, and a collexification network of emotion concepts across all languages in figure 4. These two networks, these two maps, do have cross-linguistic validity. So these are the three main networks one can see in semantics in both typology and lexical semantics of a particular language. So what's the difference? In polysemic networks, first of all, we assume that there is a very specific definition of polysemy, which is we have one lexeme, which is associated with two or more meanings that are related. And so when we say two or more, we distinguish between senses, and these sense distinctions are attributed, generally speaking, to speakers' mental representations. As for semantic maps and collexification networks, the relevant terms, rather than polysemy, are multifunctionality and collexification. Multifunctionality is reserved for grammatical functions, so it's the same phenomenon, polysemy. So we have one lexeme which is associated with two or more meanings. But again, here, no reference is being made to the relation between or among the senses. Collexification is now a term coined by Alex François, which reads like this. Sorry, I have to remove this because I don't see my slides. So a given language is said to colexify two functionally distinct senses if and only if it can associate them with the same lexical form. Again, same thing with multifunctionality, and now reference being made to not to grammatical elements but to lexical elements, but no reference to the relation between the senses. As we have already said, polysemic networks are language specific, and as for the sense distinction, in some cognitive approaches, certain criteria are applied to distinguish between distinct senses and context-dependent usages. As for semantic maps and classification networks, which have cross-linguistic relevance, sense distinctions are based upon the empirical observation of contrast between languages. So, the idea is that a function is put on the map if there is at least one pair of languages that differ with respect to a particular function, to a particular meaning. So, for example, if we have the meaning of friend, in English, we do not make a distinction between a female friend and a male friend, so it's vague with respect to the sex distinction. But some language might make a distinction between a female friend and a male friend. Then this means that we have to create two separate nodes for our map. Now, in polysemic networks, we have some similarities between, we can see some similarities between polysemic networks and semantic maps. We have nodes, we have edges. They use similar notations like edges, like directed edges, but they have different meanings. Take one of these differences. In polysemic networks, there is a prototypical meaning from which other senses are derived in radial fashion. And the arrow here shows derivation of a sense from another sense, not directionality. This is crucial. In polysemic networks, the semasiological approach is mainly adopted. That is, we start with a lexeme, and we chart the different meanings of a particular lexeme, and that's all. And we do not compare this normally with other lexemes in the same field. And they are designed to have language-specific validity, as I said. Now, in semantic maps, these do not require the identification of a prototypical sense. So if we see a map like the one you see in figure 6, there is no assumption that one of these nodes, one of these meanings is prototypical. Semantic maps combine both the onomasiological and the semasiological approach. That is, we start with a lexeme and we chart the different meanings, but we also ask now from the onomasiological perspective, what are the different words that express a particular meaning? So there's a combination of the two approaches in this method, and they're based on cross-linguistic evidence and designed to have cross-linguistic validity. And the arrows in semantic maps show something different. The arrows do designate directionality of change. Now let's see step by step what do we mean by semantic maps, how one constructs them. And let's start with the definition that Haspelmath gives. A semantic map is a geometrical representation of meanings that are linked by connecting lines and thus constitute a network. Or a different one, a semantic map is a method for visually representing cross-linguistic regularity or universality in semantic structure. And here, let me repeat this. You can see that these are technically called, edges, and direction, purpose, recipient, and experiencer. These are the nodes, and edges represent relationships between meanings. Now, let's see what I meant by a step-by-step procedure. Suppose we are given the following co-expression diagram for the meanings tree, firewood, and fire. The question would be, so we have this meaning map, like tree, firewood, and fire. And the question is, what would the possible polysemic patterns be in the language of the world? That is, can we identify the data behind this diagram? That's one of the questions we ask. Then one might say, oh, yes, we can identify the data. For example, we assume that there might be one form that co-expresses all these three meanings, like the form A, for example, that co-expresses tree, firewood, and fire. Or there could be another form in another language where, in this case, the form do, that co-expresses firewood and fire, and this lexifies tree. or another form in another language, ka, that co-expresses tree and firewood and signifies fire. Or there could also be another language in which there are three different forms for all these three functions. So if we see this specific map, we can make inferences about the possible polysemy patterns in the language of the world. And so we could also assume what is possible and what is impossible. If we have a very specific map like the one that I showed you, we expect not to see a language in which a form 2 co-expresses tree and fire, but not firewood. So what's the general idea? And let's start from the data now. These are the data. I'm not going to repeat them here. These were the data that I presented before. So the general idea is that if two meanings are expressed by one language form in at least one language, the corresponding meanings should be connected. This is why we connect firewood with fire, because there was a form do in a language that co-expressed these two functions. Same with the form ka, which co-expresses tree and firewood. We connect these two meanings. And same with a, right? And a more complex definition of what we just saw, the fact that when we connect two senses, if we find a lexeme that expresses these two senses, right, is the so-called semantic map connectivity hypothesis, which was introduced by Croft in his 2001 book, which goes like this. Any relevant language-specific and construction-specific category should map onto a connected region in conceptual space. That is, any form, right, should map onto a connected region in conceptual space. So a here maps onto tree, firewood, and fire. And all these are connected. They occupy a connected region in conceptual space. So in this particular case, we follow the semantic map connectivity hypothesis. Same with ka, which maps onto tree and firewood. Same with the do, which maps onto firewood and fire. And in this particular case, with the three markers to, su, and po, we do not violate the semantic map connectivity hypothesis. This does not follow the semantic map connectivity hypothesis, but it does not violate. All right. Now, given again this idea that if two meanings are expressed by one language form in at least one language, the corresponding meaning should be connected. The question is how we should proceed with a form that co-expresses all these three meanings. Okay? All right. So we know that a co-expresses tree and fire and firewood, so we connect it. We know that a co-expresses firewood and fire, so we connect it. But we also know that a co-expresses tree and fire, so we should connect this. And that might be a problem, but this does not follow. This does follow the connectivity hypothesis, right? And in semantic maps, we delete this edge, so the one from tree to fire. So, and there's a reason behind this. So this figure, that the one that we see, is intended to represent the minimum number of edges required to maintain semantic connectivity. All right. So we need to keep our map as economical as possible. And this follows the so-called economy principle, which reads as follows: two meanings are connected by an edge if only if they are not already part of a subgraph of meanings expressed by a single polysemic item in a given language of the sample. All right, so the idea is here, if we have meanings tree, firewood, and fire, and firewood, the meaning firewood appears always, when we also find tree and fire, so there is no need to draw an edge between tree and fire. So this is the economy principle, and that way we keep our map as economic as possible. Now, a small detour because this is the right place to introduce the distinction between collexification networks and semantic maps. So this is a typical collexification network. So this is for from clicks from the database of cross-linguistic collexifications. And you can see that we have such meanings as tree, wood, fire, among many other meanings. So this is a collexification network. But how does it differ from semantic maps? Yeah, collexification networks have edges, and that's crucial now, for every pairwise co-expression relation between lexical concepts. So for this language, Z, where we have this form ka, that's not a problem because we work in a pairwise fashion. So ka co-expresses or collexifies tree and firewood. No problem here with a do, because do co-expresses firewood and fire. But the problem is with a, right? Because we should say first that this lexeme a collexifies tree and firewood, collexifies fire and firewood, but also collexifies tree and fire. And the algorithm, let's say, stops there. Does not return back and check for what we said before about the economy principle. The fact, the question whether firewood is always present, always, sorry, when we have tree and fire in a language. As List and his colleagues listed, the problem with this approach is that it does not allow one to represent whether a given word form collexifies more than two concepts. And how one can solve this? The solution can be given through the use of hypergraphs. What's a hypergraph? This H here stands for a hypergraph. Now again, it's we have nodes, vertices, and edges, but E here is a set of hyper edges, which can contain any number of nodes from the set of nodes, right? So potentially this can include all three meanings that we have here, right? It can include all three of these meanings: tree, firewood, and fire. So we have a hypergraph here, tree and firewood, a hypergraph of fire and firewood, and a hypergraph which includes tree, firewood, and fire. That's a solution, but there are problems with this solution. Imagine what will happen if you have a huge network, a huge collexification network. If you need to add all these hypergraphs, then your network will be very, very complex, very packed. And here you can see an example of this approach, how one can use this hypergraph approach. You can delete the edges, you can have your conceptual space, and then draw, you have this closed curved lines that encircle these or the meanings, the relevant meanings. So this is the semantic map of earth, soil, and you see the semantic space of relevant lexemes in classical Greek, the term ye and chthon, for example. You see the boundaries of each lexeme. And you can do this for every single language. So if you have Egyptian, you can add Egyptian there, Syrian as we did, and so on. So Alex, there's a question.
Yeah, so this example here is, would you call it a semantic map or a network?
I mean, it's a collexification network, right? But in a way, it's not a network because you don't have the edges. We applied this hyperedge approach in order to have all our meanings at once, and so that because otherwise it's very difficult with the collexification approach to see what are the different meanings that one lexeme has. So you need to have this hypergraph.
Could you combine them? Could you have a hypergraph and then edges between country and
yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah.
But
and that would still be a semantic map, or it will be a network.
It will be a collexification. That's not the main difference between a collexification network and semantic map. So this could be both a semantic map and collexification network, depending on whether you use this economy principle. Right, that's the crucial. And you could also have closed curved lines in both approaches, in both the semantic map approach and the collexification network approach. All right, but that's the collexification network approach because we didn't take into account the economy principle. All right, and we have this hypergraph approach in order to account for the fact that a specific lexeme has all these meanings. All right. And now again, about the difference between semantic maps and collexification networks. In semantic maps, if a language form co-expresses tree and fire in our example, then it also co-expresses fire with these two meanings. So that's another difference, right? There is an implication here. In semantic maps, the absence of this particular edge encodes an implicational universal. I repeat that. What do we mean by that? We have a form in a language that co-expresses tree and fire. All right. And given this map, we assume that this form should necessarily express firewood. All right. So again, this is exploratory, right? If you do find a language that expresses only tree and fire, then you should add this edge. But in our mini map, in our mini sample, this was not the case, and yes, this is a hypothetical scenario, right? I repeat that. I don't know if there are some questions on that. Any questions?
No questions? No, yeah.
There are?
You can ask questions if you have some.
All right.
Not getting
And this now summarizes the difference between the two. Collexification networks, CNs, have edges for every pairwise co-expression relation between lexical concepts. No implicational universals can be inferred from the graph. On the other hand, in semantic maps, the absence of that edge encodes an implicational universal. And check here the difference now from the representational point of view. So back on the track. Now I will be talking about a very specific example, a real example from the additive domain. And the additive domain consists of such markers as the English preposition to. The English preposition to has at least three meanings. Directional purpose recipient, directional relative, as in the teacher is going to the school, purpose as the lifeguard ran to the rescue of the child, and recipient as in the teacher gave the book to the student. And the question is now how to arrange the different meanings, right? Given this one language, where we have one marker that expresses all these three meanings, purpose, direction, recipient, what's the right arrangement? And note that if we work with polysemic networks, if we work with language-specific networks, then one might arrange the functions based on ontological factors, on cognitive principles, say, okay, this sense belongs to the spatial domain, which is a concrete domain. So we'll consider this as my starting point, and I will start with this, and all these other senses will be derived from this sense, right? So direction in this case would be at the center, would count as the prototypical sense, but recall that semantic maps, classification networks do not talk about prototypicality here. So let's consider now other languages, because that's what we do, right? So take the German example. To express direction, we have expressions like markers like zu, ich gehe zu Anna, I'm going to Anna, or purpose Anna ging zum Spielen in the garden. Here, literally to the game, to have a game in the garden. But for the recipient, German uses a different marker, dative or something, or maybe an as well. Ich gebe dir das Buch. But the point is that we cannot use zu for the recipient. And for French, we can use a for both direction and recipient, as in je vais à Thessalonique, excuse my French. And for the recipient, take je donne le livre à Alex. But for the purpose, we cannot use in this particular context that I'm giving here. We have to use pour. So co-expresses direction and recipient. So these are the three patterns that we have. The first one is from the English data, the second one from the German, and the third one from the French. And back to our question, how to arrange the different meanings. And now, given the second set of data, like direction, we have a marker that expresses direction and purpose, but not recipient. We can exclude this arrangement, because remember that if a marker co-expresses two functions, this should appear connected. Two co-expresses direction and purpose, but these two functions here, direction and purpose, do not appear connected. Take now the second arrangement, direction, purpose, recipient, and we can reject this arrangement on the basis of the French data, because co-expresses direction and recipient, okay, and these two senses do not appear connected. All right, so this is the only possible arrangement that describes perfectly the data that we had at our disposal. And then we can use these closed curved lines to say what's language specific. English to expresses all these three, German to these two functions, purpose and direction, French direction and recipient. And all these respect the connectivity hypothesis. So how much time do I have?
So 25.
All right. Perfect.
Sure. Shall I unmute myself here? So I will this question? Or is that
maybe I should. I will mute myself now.
Okay, so I've got a question to the previous slide. So this semantic map is only based on the three languages, right? Only English, French, German. What if you have another language?
You need this.
The previous slide. One yet, yes. So this is only for the three languages. If you add another language where purpose and recipient collexify, what do you do?
Only.
Yes.
So you connect purpose.
Oh, sorry, we have to.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. All right. So if there is a marker that expresses purpose and recipient on top of all of the other markers that we have, right? You can connect purpose and recipient as well, right? So you have a triangle. All right. But then this means that every combination is possible. So this is a map that's not interesting. That's the thing. Okay, it can happen. This is exactly the example that I showed with the tree, fire, and firewood, right? If you find a language that expresses tree and firewood and fire, and only these, then this turns your map into an uninteresting one because everything is connected to anything, right? Which is not uninteresting if you add the frequency, right? Because some patterns might be much more frequent than other patterns. So you can turn an uninteresting map to an interesting one if you add other dimensions like frequency of attestation or directionality. If you have like a triangle, like the one that you suggest, if you add directionality of change, you add an arrow, then you know that only one direction is possible and not the other one. So this again is a more interesting network. 15, 21. All right. So one of the advantages of the semantic map approach is that it is neutral with respect to the monosomy, polysemy, homonymy distinction. So this is in line with what we said before, that we make no claim about the relation between the senses. Is there a relation between a tree and firewood? There might be, but the method is agnostic. I mean, they do not care. And as a starting point, of course, when you construct your map, you might want to perform like a semantic analysis and try to interpret the different connections. So that's another thing. And another advantage of the semantic map approach is that they are the semantic maps are implicational and falsifiable, right? Implicational, again, given this map, if I have direction and beneficiary, if my marker expresses direction and beneficiary, I infer that recipient is also expressed by this marker. That's what we mean by implicational. And falsifiable is what we've just discussed. If you find in the light of new data, then you can adjust your map. That's not a problem for the method. Let's now talk about the different types of maps. We have connectivity maps. These are the types of the type of maps that we have already discussed. And there are also proximity maps. In connectivity maps, these are graph based. So we have nodes, we have edges, and edges connect to the nodes. All right. This is now the semantic map of the indefinite pronouns functions. This is by a study of Haspelmath. All right, and this is now a proximity map. Right? Now here, the points that we see correspond to the meanings or context, and the proximity is very relevant here. In connectivity maps, proximity does not play a role, and this is not very important because we have the edges, and that's the important representational tool there. Proximity indicates similarity between meanings. For example, we have two meanings here, specific and known and specific unknown. So specific known, as in the English one, somebody called you, guess who? And the specific unknown, as in somebody called you, but I don't know who. Right? And you see that these two functions are close to each other. And the expectation is that they are more similar because they are closer. In fact, this means that not that they're more similar, but actually there are more languages, that there are a lot of languages that co-express these two functions. And if you compare this to the indirect negation function, indirect negation, as in the English example, I don't think that anybody called, right? And now the assumption here is that indirect negation and specific unknown are not collexified that frequently in the language of the world. And you can compare the two approaches here with the same function, specific known, specific unknown. Again, yes, the connectivity map, you see that specific unknown is distant from the indirect negation, but again, I repeat that proximity is not an important factor in connectivity maps. Some issues with the connectivity maps, as cited in the literature, semantic maps have been criticized as being able to predict more than is actually found. So that's a problem for CISO. It says that there are, given this map on indefinite pronouns functions, there are 105 different possibilities for mapping a linguistic form. One possibility is that specific noun is we have a marker that co-expresses specific noun and specific unknown. Another marker that expresses 1, 2, 3. Another one, 1, 2, 3, 4. Another one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Okay, but the problem is that Haspelmath identified only 39 different kinds of mapping, right, in his dataset. So the model predicts more than is actually found in the real map. And here you see all the 39 possibilities that are actually found in the language of the world. So the Russian marker expresses only specific noun. The English any expresses question, conditional, indirect negation, direct negation, and comparative. Or the Greek one expresses 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So all these are predicted by the model, but what is also predicted is a combination, for example, 3, 4, 6, 8, right? 3, 4, 6, 8, which is not found in the data. So this is one case that the model predicts more than is actually found. So one issue with the connectivity maps is that it's practically impossible to handle large-scale cross-linguistic datasets manually. And that's a problem because ideally it should be possible to generate semantic maps automatically on the basis of a given set of data. So after a certain point, we need to draw maps automatically, which till a certain point in time was impossible, which was made possible in 2013. Issues with proximity maps. The multidimensional scale method, that is the proximity map approach, has been criticized because it cannot take into account diachronic information if available. And there is no way, for example, to infer any directionality from the map in figure 14, not 4. So if you compare this to figure 13, where it is possible to infer directionality of change, so we know that directionality will take place between nodes that are connected. So it can be the case that we'll find a marker that expresses specific unknown, and then a point at the next diachronic stage will express question, right? So this is a directionality which is inferred by the map. This is not possible in the map in figure 14. Now we have different types of meanings that can be represented on the map. We can have grammatical meanings like case markers, indefinite pronouns, and so on, but also lexical meanings like the meaning, for example, breathe or breath. That's the semantic map constructed by Alex in his seminal paper on collexification and on lexical semantic maps. So the meanings of semantic maps can be of any kind: grammatical, lexical, or even constructional. There are some studies that have considered this. All these works that I cite here concerned with the interplay of lexical and grammatical information in representation in semantic maps, explicitly in construction grammar terms and the use of grammatical constructions, and Koptjevskaja-Tamm in terms of layers. So semantic maps, according to Koptjevskaja-Tamm, consist of three layers: words and their formal relations, morphosyntactic properties, constructions that occur in these other three layers, a morphosyntactic layer, a more formal relatedness layer, and a constructional layer. And this is an example given in her paper, in her 2022 paper from the temperature domain, where we have here the meanings: tactile, ambient, quasi-referential, ambient, non-referential, and that's PF. That's what is PF? I don't recall.
Psychological.
I don't remember. Yes. So in tactile, like in the stones are hot or cold, right? The quasi-referential as the weather is cold, the non-referential it is cold, and then this is the I am cold, meaning personal. Yes, personal. Mm-hmm. And you see now these are the meanings, the constructions, or let me start from the first layer, the morphosyntactic one. Some meanings are expressed via nouns, we see some others via adjectives. And then we check for the formal relatedness between the two, in this particular case, categories, parts of speech. So what's the relation between the noun meaning cold and the adjective meaning cold? And then we see the specific constructions through which we have the expression of these meanings. So these are the layers according to Marshall. Now, some researchers use different representational modes depending on the question they want to address. For example, Rahilna and her colleagues wanted to investigate some metaphorical extensions in a particular field, in the field of falling, and they tried to represent metaphor as well in a way. So they suggest that we could represent metaphor that way. So you have like the non-metaphorical level and then the metaphorical level at some other layer on your map. Of course, this will make your map a bit, again, packed, very dense, but then one can focus on a specific domain and focus on a very specific phenomenon, and this makes sense more. Then if you,
what kind of figure was that?
so that's a let's say, as Rahil and your colleagues say, a visual metaphor of the metaphorical and the non-metaphorical senses, right? So you need to have two layers. Their point is that you cannot conflate both. You cannot have at the same time, on the same map, both the metaphorical senses and the non-metaphorical ones. So you need an additional dimension. So that's their suggestion. We didn't do so in our paper. So we had all this information packed in one map. Here we can use, for example, for metaphors, this notation, okay? This the extension now from springtime to youth is been shown with this vector here and with this dashed arrow, let's say, a vertical dashed arrow. And this is different from the connection between springtime and summer. This indicates a metonymic relationship. If you don't see an arrow, this implies synchronic conification. If you see an arrow, this implies diachronic conification. Then you can also manipulate the transparency of the arrow, right, to indicate, for example, that the connection between moon and day is not that is loose, is not that strict. For example,
is that quantitative, like there are fewer languages that do it?
No, that's qualitative. This arrow is based on just one language here. This is based on ancient Greek. So the extension from moon and day, it does happen, but it happens only in a specific environment. To be more precise, it happens in certain contexts, in certain, text types. Same with the extension from sun to day, 24 hours. This is an extension that is observed in ancient Egyptian that occurs in a specific environment, constructional environment. So you need to have every, if I remember correctly, every sun will mean every day. If you don't have this every in front of sun, it does not mean day. And we wanted to capture this fact that it's not a real extension. It's like a compound. It's like what you may call loose classification, exactly. So we call this diachronic loose classification.
Or phrasal, maybe?
Phrasal.
I don't know.
Now, moving on with more representational modes, Nikitina, in her paper on grain-related words in South Mande, used these edges here. Now, this indicates frequency of attestation. So, singulative use with paired body parts you have a form that expresses this function and expresses also individual unit of a mass. And this co-expression pattern is found in 3 languages. And you are given this information by the 3 lines that you see there. And now the dashed line here means that the connection, do I remember that correctly, is the extension is based on reconstruction. Yes, one of the cases that this extension from bone to grain or vice versa is based on reconstruction. It's not attested in real data. Now, again, about other representational modes, we have mentioned that you can manipulate the thickness of the weight to indicate that a certain pattern, a certain collection pattern is more frequent than other patterns. And now compare figure 21 to figure 22. 1, 2 is a marker, okay, and 1, 2, 3 another marker, and we see that 1, 2 and 1, 2, 3 are co-expressed very frequently in the language of the word, and we take this information from the weighted semantic map we see on the right hand, right? So we manipulated the thickness of the weight of the edge, sorry, and this indicates, this represents frequency of attestation. And so what one can do more beyond the thickness of the weight, one could also include information about different clusters, different communities, different groups within a particular semantic map. So this is now a weighted semantic map of the indefinite pronouns functions, the one suggested by Haspelmath, right? But then we have 2 additions here. First, we added the frequency of attestation of the patterns. So you see here that question conditional is much more frequent in the language of the world than specific known, specific unknown. And there's another information here that specific known, specific unknown, and irrealis non-specific form a group. Same with question conditional. Same with direct negation, indirect negation, comparative, and free choice. So we have 3 distinct communities. And now the interesting thing is that this can be done automatically. We used centrality measures and modularity, the modularity analysis. which assists this procedure, right? If we want to indicate what are the groups of a particular network, this is the way to go. You run the modularity analysis and you take the different groups. And then, of course, the question is to check whether these groups make any sense, right? Now, as we already mentioned, you can add an arrow on an edge. You have directionality. That's an important feature of the connectivity map. And as for the scope, so far, many studies have focused on the grammatical domain, and they are synchronic. There are, as you see now, a list of case studies like on additives, adversatives, temporal markers, which focus on the grammatical domain, and there are synchronic studies. There are fewer studies in the lexicon and synchronic studies. You see again a list of domains like emotions, spatial domain, so on. There are few studies on grammar that rely on diachronic evidence, and there are fewer studies, even fewer studies on the lexicon that add the diachronic dimension. And these are two of the studies that use the semantic map approach for the lexicon and add directionality. And I will refer to these specific studies in my third seminar. So stay tuned. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, could you unmute yourselves if you're discussing things?
All right, thank you. Yes, in fact, there are two types of networks, semantic maps and classification networks. And there is this distinction based on the economy principle and based on the fact whether we get implications from semantic maps, we get implications from classification networks, we don't. So the difference stops there. They are pretty similar. Actually, you have to dig in very much in order to see the real differences, right? Now, the other representational modes are simply other additional representational modes that, I mean, let's say features that one can add to a semantic map or a classification network, depending on the question that you have. Like, for example, if I want to If my study is diachronic, then I will use an arrow. This does not change my perspective. So my type of
are you new to?
no.
No. People
Can people hear
Can you
Athanasios?
Yeah.
They can.
I think they couldn't hear me, but they can hear you. Check
All right.
again, ask them if they can hear.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Okay.
All right. So the question, Alex's question, if they didn't hear your question, is whether we have, because I presented many different maps, and the question is whether these different maps are really different maps, so different types of maps, and the question is whether I can do a typology of these networks or something. And my answer is that we have like two main types. In connectivity maps, right? In connectivity maps, we have two main types: semantic maps and collexification networks. And then there are the proximity maps, the one with the dots. So that's a map. Yes. Let's say we have two categories, because my focus was on connectivity maps. That's why I started answering in a different way. So we have like one label. I don't know how to call this general thing. Semantic maps slash let's say proximity maps. Okay, let's call this general category that way. So there are two types: connectivity maps and proximity maps. First of all, connectivity maps and proximity maps. Now forget about proximity maps. Connectivity maps, there are two
proximity
types.
maps were figures where the distance is very significant.
Yes,
exactly. Like an MDS.
Exactly. Actually, this is an MDS.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I didn't focus on MDS.
Sure.
And now our focus is on connectivity maps. So there are two main types there: semantic maps and collexification networks. So these are two graph-based maps. And now, if you have
you can show maybe the slides where where you did illustrate this in the beginning, so people understand. So this is an example. I mean, they don't hear me.
So yeah, this is here an example of a proximity map, right? And this is an example of a connectivity map. Okay. This is also an example of a semantic map. But let me go back. Sorry, I'll do this. All right. Oh, yeah, that's better. So now figure 3 is a semantic map, right? And figure 4 is a collexification network. All right. And so these are the two main types. Now, one might want to focus on diachrony. If you want to focus on diachrony, you use arrows. That's a representational convention you adopt in order to work with diachronic data. It's not that you are using a different type of map. And you can do that in both collexification networks and semantic maps. Now, if you are interested in not only the connections, but also in the frequency of attestation, you add the thickness of the weight. You take into account the thickness of the weight. So you manipulate the thickness depending on the frequency of attestation. So that's not another type of map. It's just you're using a different representational technique on the map. Okay, so on. Now, for example, Nikitina in her paper. Yes, this one here. Since her sample was only 4 languages, and she could take advantage of this fact and use the different lines to indicate the frequency of attestation. Because for her, it was interesting to differentiate between what's a reconstructed meaning and what's not. So the dashed line indicates this, and the non-dashed line indicates that it's a synchronic association, and so on. And in this case, we had set a very we wanted to reach a certain goal. We want to take into account the mechanisms that connect meanings, so metaphors, metonymies, directionality of change, but also asynchronic associations. So we have undirected edges, like clock hour, directed edges, like time hour, but this is not enough. We wanted to differentiate between metonymic associations. So this type of dashed line indicates metonymic association, and that type of dashed line indicates metaphoric association. Then you see a delta shape arrow here between season and time, yes, which indicates, which suggests that season was a meaning for a particular form, but we are able only to reconstruct this meaning. So similar to what Nikitina did, but we used a different convention. What I would have liked to see, I mean, it's like to use the same notations for the same phenomenon. That's something that we should agree on, right? If I have like a reconstructed meaning, let's use the same symbol. Okay, that would be a nice way to work, right? I hope that this answers your question.
Do we have other questions? Yeah, from the end of your answer now. Yeah, it looks like it looks like we are in the early years of a new discipline, you know, where we haven't had conventions totally settled, and every website or every paper tries. I mean, there are some you know, practices which are already getting more and more used, but people are experimenting with new types of maps. Hence, this explains also the diversity of maps. But maybe we're reaching a stage of maturity when there could be we could be starting to try and maybe standardize a little bit the types of maps or types of graph, or you know, like as you say, to have the same, to conventionalize certain symbol to mean this is a metonymic extension or a metaphoric extension or something.
That's not without problems.
Yeah, of course.
We rely on softwares. We use special tools. For example, this one was constructed using Cytoscape. And Cytoscape is not limited. Has only a specific number of shapes on the edges. So I'm restricted by this fact, right? This is a limitation. So if someone uses a different software, then it will be a different notation, and that's a thing that we cannot resolve, right?
Okay, thank you. If there's no other question, I'd like you to perhaps to take a couple of minutes to tell us what you plan to do in the next session, or the next 3 sessions, or at least the next one. Yep.
Yes. So in the second session, we will focus on how one can manually and automatically construct semantic maps. So we will start with the problem that I mentioned before. Let me show you. Yes, this one here. Okay. One criticism against connectivity maps was that it was practically impossible to construct them automatically. So it was very difficult to find a way to find an algorithm that will construct automatically. But researchers did find a solution. So there's a paper by Regier and his colleagues that used an algorithm by Andrin and his colleagues, which comes from social sciences. Okay? and they managed to solve the solution. I will show you this. So how we, in a way, I will start with the history of the problem. I will start with the connectivity maps, the problem that we could not construct them automatically. I will show how one can plot them. So what are the steps we should follow in order to plot them manually, so that we know the background. And then I will show in a step-by-step fashion how one can construct them automatically using special software, and I will provide the algorithm. And I think it will be easy even for people that do not have any background on Python or on using visualization software or something to construct them. And
so even linguists can follow.
Even myself, I mean, I'm not an expert in, I'm not a computer scientist or something. So I learned to do this on my own. I mean, and I would like to give this knowledge because I know it's very hard to find the appropriate software and to really deal with this massive data. I mean, it's very, very difficult. So that will be in the second session. In the third session, I will present two case studies. The one on the diachronic dimension into semantic maps, but in the lexical domain. And the second case study will be on how one can detect aerial and universal patterns using different methods like collexification, semantic maps, and other techniques, right? And with using as a case study the perception and cognition domains. And the final one, as I said in the beginning, we will move to the language specific. I will return to the basics, like I will talk about polysemy within a language, particular language. My case studies will focus on ancient Greek and modern Greek. And I will discuss a very important, as I believe, approach, the so-called behavior profile approach, which was introduced by Diviak and Greece back in 2006. And I will apply this method to my own data, ancient Greek data, and modern Greek data. So this is a very brief overview of what I will do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is inspiring for the next few sessions on semantic maps.
So I hope everybody has been able to follow. There was not too many sound issues or visual issues. So if you're interested to come next week online or in Paris, then we can learn how to. Perhaps the next session will be a bit more a demonstration of what software can, what types of software exists. I mean, software or algorithm tools,
Yes.
and which ones can be used. And with maybe some demonstration based on data that you can show us how to actually do these wonderful figures. Okay. Thank you very much to
Thanks a lot,
everybody for attending, and hope to see you next week and every Thursday this month, and the first Thursday of July. Kalispera. Thank you very much. Ευχαριστώ.